Hello, welcome back to Kerbal Space Program. This is SquashWarp, where I try to do not only the entire regular stock tech tree, but also, the interstellar and near future and all kinds of fun stuff. Today we are starting out with a relatively mundane project. Gray and Kerman is flying on the Acheron space vehicle, a single capsule on top of a couple of rockets. And the only goal here is to reach Kerbin's North Pole. There's science up there. We've got a bunch of science experiments on our ship, some landing legs, and a heat shield. And we've all done this a million times, right? You just, go up to the poles. And I apologize if you hear the washing machine in the background, but life goes on while space travel is happening. So this rocket didn't really work at all. She's burning all the fuel she's got, and I actually stop and save a little bit of fuel to burn at the Apoaps, which isn't even out of the atmosphere, just to try to get a little bit more engine efficiency. But we are grossly underspec'd for this. I think I really underestimate how much Kerbin's rotation assists with reaching orbit from the Kerbal Space Center when you go east, because this thing should have had the specs to get into orbit. But I think what its problem is that too much of the Delta V is in a low thrust upper stage, and there's not enough meat down at the lower stage. So Gray and Kerman, who has already flown a mission, doesn't get any experience from this. Oddly enough, though, there's a couple experiments on our capsule that we haven't done in the water yet, so at least we get something out of this. And Grain gets to go swimming in a sort of frigid, temperate waters. Hopefully it's nice and warm wherever she has ended up. Alright, the Acheron 2. More boosters. Those don't burn nearly as long as I kind of expected them to. So after our boosters separate, we're pretty much in the same situation we were in before. Gray and Carmen again hopped right back in. She was like, give me another one of those, I can do better. Just taking a moment, noticing how nice that real plume effect looks. And this one I think actually could have made it. I went ahead and waited to burn the engines again, just kind of get more specific impulse out of them at the top of the parabolic trajectory there. And about to run out of fuel in our first stage, but we have a whole second stage, I thought. See, this one doesn't. So I thought, that my problem is I put all of my Delta V in that upper stage, but really that doesn't solve our problem at all. What it does do is have us coming in from even higher altitude at a much higher velocity, and the heat shield's up for it, but it seems to be conducting heat up to the science experiment, and that science experiment is starting to turn red, and that's unnerving for a number of reasons. Gran Kerman says she doesn't care. She seems to be brave. And there goes our science junior. But we still have our heat shield smushed, pressed up against the back of our craft due to the aerodynamic pressure, and then once it falls off, it's full-time trying to use what electricity we have left to get into an orientation so the parachute doesn't burn off. I thought that I may have killed my Kerbal. We end up in this weird belly flop posture, which probably wasn't very comfortable, but I thought at least maybe we would make it to the tundra or something, but no, we're just, we're in the grasslands. No useful science to be done. I've been fast-forwarding a day or so between launches when I remember to. This is Acheron 3, and now we've got Malfry Kerman, a new face, a new rocket pilot. When it was determined that Gran wasn't leaving the atmosphere on these flights anyway, we figured we might as well give another Kerbal a try. And I still, it's been like a year that Kerbals have had experience, and I still haven't gotten it straight in my head exactly how it works. And I'm sure I'm just being superstitious, but I like the idea of kind of getting one at a time. You get the experience from the most useful thing that you do. But I think that that ultimately means a Kerbal who just goes to orbit will still end up with the same experience as a Kerbal who flew first and then went to orbit. Um, which is, I mean, I think that's how it works. But we're still, you know, nah, we haven't even made it to the poles yet. You see me pumping some fuel around because I want to try re-entering with the engine first because it tends to take the heat pretty well, and haven't really changed the vehicle at all other than added a couple more boosters to it. Stretched the tank a bit. Beautiful auroras there moving along the top. Nice swirling pattern. But Malfry is not, well, he doesn't even get to see them, honestly. He can do some science, but we have to detach because it starts to flip over, and immediately the science experiment blows up. The heat shield gets pressed up against the back of our spacecraft, but it's slowly sliding off. Luckily, those storage containers, what are those called? Service bays have a very high heat tolerance, just like the capsule, but I don't want to go face first, so I'm just spinning around wildly. This whole series, I think that the Acheron is like the river of sorrow or something, so, maybe I should stop picking mythical rivers. But at long last, we make it to a new biome. And, we've done sort of a proof of concept on a number of our technologies. Luckily, we have all our science, except our materials bay was attached to the inside. It was attached to the bottom of the service bay and then flipped around, rather than being safely attached on the inside. So it blows up because it's the first thing that hits the ground, which is unfortunate. But we can still plant a flag to commemorate the finally successful mission of the Acheron series of rockets, which will not be being used again. We're going to move on to bigger and better things. And a few days later, we come back to the Space Center and get ready for those bigger things I was speaking of. Just a little bit of checking out what's available in the R&D Center after we've gathered some science. And I end up going with some of these aerodynamic parts, specifically because I want to fly my passengers. And lift off of the Nile rocket, moving on to non-fictional rivers now. Solid rocket boosters getting us just some extra altitude and velocity early on, because without them we just have kind of a low thrust-to-weight ratio on the pad. After an explosive separation, we are back onto our single liquid fuel rocket, and this one is a non-gimbaling engine, and I only have those little steerable fins there, and I'm having trouble getting my pitch where I want it. I usually like to be about 45 degrees by the time I'm passing 10 kilometers, so this is a bit of a steep launch for my taste, but it's going to be just fine. This thing has so much delta V, we really could take this much farther than we're going to, and we even have a little bit of reserve in the form of a couple of RCS retro thrusters and the monopropellant that's in that capsule. So Gray and Carmen is going to go to space. She's been to the edge of space a couple of times in the ill-fated Acheron boosters, and she's finally going to go up there and do some science. Anyway, like I was saying, I'm going to start imposing sort of in-house rules for launches. I like the idea of just setting like a 7-day timer for myself and doing one rocket launch a week, and then I can launch however many planes or anything like that that I want to. A week sounds like a nice round number. I've used Kerbal Construction Time in the past, and it's an awesome mod. I just had my game data folder is very full right now, and rather than spend more time downloading and installing stuff, I think I'm just going to stick with what I have and impose a little bit of just rules for myself. Same thing with the science. I've said I have to unlock each tier at a time, um, so no rushing for a specific experiment or something like that. And I'm gonna set myself a time limit after each tier of the tech tree has been unlocked before I start working on the next tier. I feel like that's a nice, easy compromise. Doesn't take a lot of thought, but does impose an interesting limit if we ever end up in a situation we need to do a rescue mission or we have a launch window. We are going to have to be concerned about making sure that we've got we won't be able to launch a rescue mission immediately after some kind of problem. So we always have to be careful and keep that in mind. I've got so many other little mod menus I'm setting up here. But what we did is we burned straight for a 250 something kilometer orbit. As long as it's over 250, we get the high altitude science. And I'm currently, actually, this is an interesting thing I like doing, started recently, is adding in a heads-up display through Kerbal Engineer specifically for maneuver nodes that gives me the time until burn counter rather than the time until the node. And after a quick burn, we've brought our periaps out of the atmosphere and we can safely orbit around Kerbin a few times, doing our EVA reports as we go. There's just a few more biomes along the equator that we can grab. The main goal was to get a high, in space high over Kerbin EVA report and crew report. We could be transmitting all this and getting the science right away, but I'm slightly concerned about battery usage, especially since we do have TAC life support and we need our electricity. So that's me to set a timer for apoaps, and we're going to just enjoy the view. This game is so nice. And once we're up close to apoaps, we can turn around, and we haven't even gone onto the second stage yet, right? So you can see my delta V readout up at the top. You know, there's like hundreds of meters per second available for us, especially when we're on the final stage there, which I need to right-click to use. I don't even know why I put that. I could have just stuck with the regular old. It would have been a single stage to orbit with some boosters. Which makes, I guess, it's like a stage and a half to orbit. That's it for Grayan. I didn't bother trying to land near the Space Center or anything. You know, maybe you get lucky and land in the Badlands or something, but this is certainly, for the Kerbals, an historic mission. Kerbinaut, a Kerbinaut, there we go, Kerbal astronaut. A Kerbinaut has safely flown to space and returned. You know, not had to do 3 iterations of the same rocket like I keep having to do with all of my big lifters here. We just end up in the Highlands or something. We've already done the science, so Grayan's just going to plant a flag. And now it's Malfry-Kerbin's turn to make history and be the second Kerbal in orbit, flying on the Nile Beta. I figure, you know, if for some reason we have to make a bunch of these, we'll end up with the Nile Delta, and that'll be funny, because that's a place. Anyway, it's a virtually identical rocket with one small exception we'll get to in a bit, and we're launching into a polar orbit because that way we can do EVA reports in space low over all of the biomes. There's no need for us to go into space high for the sake of an EVA report, but we may do so for other reasons. I've moved the solar panels into three-way symmetry there just to make room for a part that we're going to deploy in a second. And burned up to a pretty high altitude right off the bat, and not being very conservative with my fuel because it doesn't really matter. We get so much speed out of those solid boosters and only those little fins to change our heading that we really would need to launch already leaning over if we wanted to get a more shallow trajectory. So I take a look at my life support timing there and decide I'm going to set an alarm for the point at which Malfry's going to run out of food, water, and oxygen, which is going to be like 30 days. So I set an alarm just in case. I gave him an extra container of the life support as well, because I wasn't sure how long this was going to take. This one, it really is true. Going into a polar orbit takes a lot more delta V when you're working in small margins. It really does make a difference. adding the period to my orbital information display because I don't want my orbital period to divide evenly into the rotational period of Kerbin. And that is because of this nice part here from the beautiful ScanSat mod that most people have probably seen and should try if they haven't. Fun little behavior there is that when we hop out to do an EVA report, because this ship is so small, we get this fun little rotation every time. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's like he's riding a horse or something. Kerbal horses. Now that'd be interesting, is finding a way to make a horse out of Kerbal Space Program parts. Anyway, I just let it rotate so that our radar scanning array is pointed at the planet. And Science Here and Now is only alerting me to new biome information. So we got the last few, and it was poles and ice shelf and badlands and desert that we hadn't gone over before for one reason or another. And now we just have to settle into orbiting the planet for a while. And we might have to change our altitude. If we want to get this done faster, which we do, we want to be at a higher altitude. See, there's a certain the way that those ScanSat scanners work. There's a certain angle that it'll scan at. I think the stock scanner's this way as well. You want to go to the upper edge of its range to get that wider angle. But if you go too high, you'll end up with such a long orbital period that it'll take longer. And if you are in an orbit that goes around the planet in a way that divides evenly into the rotational period of the planet, then you end up in this situation where you're going over the same spot multiple times. So we're adjusting the orbit. I've looked this up in the past and gotten optimal orbits and done the math at other times to get optimal orbits, but this time we just adjust a few times. But once we insert in here, we're going to go take a look at what's going on the ground and let Malfry do some work up there. This is the Agravain airplane here. Another round table reference. And Dudrin from our aircraft division is going to fly Ribley Kerman, our top scientist, and Jebgel, our newest recruit, are going to fly over to the island runway and check out what's going on over there. Going back to 4 times time acceleration because seriously, this is kind of a long trip otherwise. This is no island speed record. I'm checking out the keep fit. I haven't paid much attention to keep fit at all. Hopefully it's not going to, kill one of my Kerbals when I'm not paying attention. I don't think I've ever actually done a full playthrough with it. Anyway, this plane, I just built this very specifically. There's no science on this at all. This is really just to give joyrides. And, I feel like that's an important induction. When we get new team members, we should take them over the runway or put them under some live G-forces with those nice B9 air brakes. And boy, we really didn't stay there at all. Rigby got out and Ribley got out and walked around, but really there's not much to do there other than plant flags, which we're gonna just skip through. An attempt at a speed record. And we got up to Mach 1. We couldn't really get past it, and the ocean was coming up quick, and we were close to the runway. This plane flies nice, but I did have to... I did a little test flight beforehand that I only cut out just because it was just a little circuit around the runway, and then we landed again. It was kind of boring. But with one Kerbal, you can eject and use this parachute. When there's 3 and you don't have the ejection system yet, they're in danger. And as Dudrin brings everyone safely back from their little joyride, we'll jump back over to Malfry and see how he's been doing. He's actually had to adjust his orbit a couple other times because he was getting some weird overlaps just because of laziness at mission control, not doing any math or looking anything up on the internet. Actually, I found it really easy to get optimal ScanSat altitudes for every planet except Kerbin, but I really didn't look very hard. So now we're just going to come home, and we are waiting for our Kerbal Space Center continent to come back, but we're not going to make it anywhere near the actual runway. But after transmitting our final science and closing up the service bay, the mission can come to an end. This time we actually did use most of the fuel in that tank, what with all of our adjustments. So I think it was a good choice to kind of overbuild this rocket, and even though we didn't use it the first time, we used it now. And coming into the ocean on the west side of the Space Center continent, Malphite Kerman becomes the second Kerbal in space, and he's got like a 9-day endurance record now. And finally, we have the Crocodile. This is our largest unmanned vehicle with our usual exploding booster separation and some squirrely control surfaces here. But we're taking a bunch of science out to the moon, and we don't really care about returning this vehicle. We'll get, you know, the full science value when we do manned missions in the future. But for now, this is just going to go out and do to the moon what we have done to Kerbin. And we had a bit of a weird... at launch, I couldn't quite keep it on 90 degrees, so we ended up in a bit of an inclined orbit by a couple of degrees. But actually, it served our purposes fantastically, because that little bit of orbital inclination means that when we go out to meet with the moon, it will be very easy to get into a polar orbit without doing any extra course corrections. So you can see we've got another radar scanners from ScanSat on our ship there, and with just a little bit of moving that around and some fine tuning, I like to switch to the body that I'm going to, and then use some fine adjustments from Precise Node there, just to get us exactly where we want to be. But because of that little bit of inclination, we end up easily getting into a polar orbit of the moon without having to do a course correction halfway, which is quite nice. It saves us a bit of time. The Crocodile is equipped with 2 different communication systems, but we don't really ended up needing to deploy them. The moon is close enough that all of our antennas reach. I'm not sure if that's a stock behavior. I think that it is, but I also believe that I've got the range modified a bit from custom barn kits, because I have Outer Planets mod and no extra antennas. And that's fine with me, because I don't plan on doing a lot of antenna stacking. And flying out to the moon, and at this point I'm thinking, oh, where is it? We've set an alarm for sphere of influence change, but I cannot find the moon, and I'm looking around. And finally I decide to point at the ground once we're in the sphere of influence, and it's the only way I know. It's actually right above the sun right there, and I was having a hard time seeing it. I didn't notice it until I used the spacecraft like an arrow. And transmitting what science we can, since we've got plenty of electricity from these solar panels. When the 1.2 pre-release came out, it was a bit more like remote tech in the way that transmitting scientific data was extremely high electricity usage, and I had a number of problems at first because of that. But I think that they've balanced it in a comfortable way. But hey, our first moon encounter is a success. It sure is a lot easier when you're not in regular old career mode and you don't have to worry about not having nodes, maneuver nodes yet. But I'm doing, well, doing is a strange way to say it. I've been working on a Twitch campaign of mostly stock Kerbal Space Program career mode, and so I'm doing all of those steps, but it's nice to just get into the science sandbox and play the way that I used to, frankly. And we've deployed our radar scanning array here. We did our close flyby at like 13 kilometers to get the low altitude science, which was super lucrative for us, and also to have a a very inexpensive maneuver burn there. But now we're going to go out to a higher altitude and not necessarily circularize, but get into an iso-orbit with a orbital period that looks relatively random. So hopefully that will serve us well. But we will find out how the scanning of the moon goes in a future episode, and then hopefully use that awesome map that it gets generated to pick a landing site. We certainly get a little bit of science from that transmission, which we can use to unlock a few more things at the R&D center. Not the big engines yet, unfortunately, but ooh, truss structures. Well, signing off from the Space Center. Thanks for watching.